Today I face perhaps my greatest challenge. I've set myself the goal of reviewing the Intel Arc A380, an entry-level GPU in a market that's almost forgotten the meaning of the word. An oasis in the post-crypto desert, a glass of water to a drowning man, and despite all my instincts screaming at me, I have to avoid focusing on how bad it is. The Arc A380 is not a gaming GPU, or at least that's what I'm told. Certain communities have adopted this card as their champion, thanks to its support for hardware AV1 acceleration. I'll concede that it looks like a great deal for home media servers, Twitch streamers, or other creatives who need to capture and export high-quality video at low bitrates, and for whom the alternative would be very expensive. When I last looked at the A380 in November 2023, it would turn out to be a faulty card, only operating at about 75% performance in games. However, several commenters from the aforementioned communities got pretty riled up that I dared use their precious A380 in gaming at all. It's not for gaming, they said, so it's unfair to compare it to Radeons and GeForces. Well, to that, I would say that nobody seems to have told Intel that their A380 GPU isn't for gaming. And so, without someone to prove that it's not, a lot of consumers looking to buy something to get started in PC gaming might make that mistake. With an MSRP of $149 and currently selling for between £120 and £150 in the UK, it looks pretty compelling for gamers on a budget. Aside from a handful of old RX 580s and the occasional display adapter, the closest modern GPUs in price are the RX 6400, starting at about £140, and the RX 6500 XT and GTX 1650, starting from £145. Compared to these cards, the A380 has 6GB of VRAM, 2GB above the competing cards, and a total of 4 display outputs, utterly embarrassing the comparable AMDs. With specs like that, and the references to gaming on the sites of Intel and their board partners, I don't think it's unreasonable to at least test the A380 out to see how it measures up. Which, these days, I do with my 2024 moderately priced gaming PC, based on a Ryzen 5 7500F, B650 motherboard, and 32GB of DDR5 RAM. I'm not hopeful going into this. While my first experience with the A380 was tainted somewhat, it still gave me the impression that even a full power card wouldn't come close to the more established budget GPUs in terms of performance. On the other hand, even though I don't expect the A380 to compete in the gaming arena, I feel compelled to be a bit more lukewarm than I normally would. You see, Intel's presence in the consumer GPU market is important. The Arc A750 and 770 have been quite disruptive in their price category, and if they can get over their various bugs and glitches, Arc promises to be a good alternative to Nvidia and AMD in the future. However, Intel aren't having a great time of it right now, and if they cancel the Arc project, it could be bad for the industry as a whole. Everyone knows how much stock multi-billion-dollar corporations hold in the opinions of YouTube channels with just over 50,000 subscribers, meaning I need to tread carefully lest I single-handedly sink the budget GPU market altogether. So, maybe, if I sound cheerful enough, they'll mistake my forced optimism for a positive review. Oh god. Alan Wake 2 is a notoriously tough game to play on even the most powerful gaming GPUs out there, so why I thought it was a good idea to start this video with it is a very good question. The A380 can actually manage a near 30 FPS average frame rate, though only by dropping to the low quality preset and the resolution scaling to performance. On the positive side, that's on par with a flagship GPU like the GTX 1080 Ti and Radeon 7. Just don't think too hard about why that is. Avatar, that's a pretty game with a big open world and very complex geometry and effects. One that no one would reasonably expect this card to do well in. Once more, the A380 exceeds expectations, completing the canned benchmark with an average FPS of 30 and lows of 22. This is the best result I've seen so far in this game, and is a good 15% faster than AMD integrated graphics, and more than 200% faster than a Dell display adapter. Somehow I don't think it's going to hold on to the top spot for long. Starfield! We tried to make this thing play Okay, fine. Yes, at 1080 medium with 75% resolution scaling, the A380 only manages 20 FPS. And yes, that is worse than the Radeon 780Mi GPU, but there's still plenty of ways of increasing frames. There's the low preset, and you could drop scaling below 75%. And sure, that might make it ugly, but at least it will be playable. If Starfield has anything going for it, it's the compelling story and innovative gameplay. Resident Evil does pretty well, actually. Whereas 4GB cards like the GTX 1650 would require settings dropping into the dirt to stay under the VRAM limit, the A380 can run at balanced with basically no compromises. The average FPS is a shade under the Magic 50, which doesn't compare that well to other entry-level GPUs, but it's at least a step above the sub-30 experiences we've had so far. Experiences like The Last of Us. Again, this is a 30 average, and for a console-esque title originally intended to be used with a controller, 30 isn't that egregious. Unfortunately, to get this average requires dropping to 1080p low, and breaking past 30 would involve using upscaling, which would be a shame considering how nice this game can look, but in this case it genuinely is a great story that maybe you'd be happy sacrificing visuals in order to play at a decent FPS. Again, I can't really knock the A380 in Ratchet and Clank. Well, I can. It's worse than most similarly priced GPUs, but it's not a train wreck, which is perhaps the best we can hope for in the circumstances. The average at 1080 medium, no upscaling, is 37 FPS with lows in the mid-20s. Not at all unplayable, and still pretty good looking too. It's a similar story in Cyberpunk 2077, and that was a pretty big surprise. Perhaps this is a title that Intel's driver developers have been focusing on, because at 1080 medium it can manage 39 FPS. This puts it on par with the RX 580, the real one, not the 2048 SP version, and better than either the GTX 1060 or 1650. Way to go, Intel. Forza Horizon 5, however, was not so great, averaging just 55 FPS at 1080 high with TAA enabled. Of course, the high preset's overrated, and temporal anti-aliasing is for cowards who are intimidated by jaggies. The only GPUs I've tested in the last year that performed worse than this are the RX 6300, the mobile GTX 1050 from my old Dell laptop, and the faulty A380. Unfortunately, I still can't start Fortnite for some reason, so my only multiplayer title for this video is Call of Duty Warzone. It's good to see that the Arc A380 can give a modestly playable experience with an average of 53 FPS at 1080 basic. You should be able to squeeze 60 FPS out of it with some upscaling, which wouldn't be my preference for this type of game, but the option is there. On the forced positive side, at least it scored 30% higher than the faulty card did. I'd like to be able to say my second Arc A380 experience was unproblematic, but that would be a lie. I wasted about half a day trying to do the simplest of tasks, installing the drivers. I tried all the versions available on the Intel support site, I tried one from a third-party site, and I tried the same driver set I used with the last card back in November. And every time was the same. The driver would unpack, the window would pop up to say the installer was loading, and then it would immediately close itself. I tried the update assistant, which had the same result, but at least kept a log that explained that it had failed rather than just leaving me hanging. I even tried a second PC with a fresh Windows 10 installation, but no dice. I ended up doing a manual driver installation, which Intel included instructions for, so I guess this sort of thing happens more often than you'd expect. This did work, but didn't install the control panel, meaning I wasn't able to try any overclocking. Also, I was curious about something I'd heard about Arc GPUs, that their drivers take up a lot of CPU cycles and could cause games to become CPU limited more easily than with, say, a Radeon. I benchmarked 8 of the titles on a Ryzen 3 3100, a weaker quad-core from about 4 years ago, and aside from most games requiring a second test run to make sure I got a stutter-free result, the results were nearly identical. Averages were within the margin of error overall, whereas 1% lows were about 6.5% improved on the 6-core. This isn't to say that there's no problem with driver overhead on Intel GPUs, simply that these games are all too GPU limited and the card's too weak for it to be an issue. All joking aside then, if the Arc A380 really is this bad, what's the alternative? After all, I've publicly criticised AMD for the RX 6500 XT, and while I've never tested the 6400, I can't imagine I'll feel any better about it. The GTX 1650 is about 6 years old, only has 4 gigs of RAM, and has none of the RTX features that are really the only reason to buy an Nvidia. I'm usually one for recommending used or refurbished items, and if you're not bothered by that, then you might consider the RX 5500, which is still being sold on AliExpress for less than £100, and which I'll be reviewing in a few weeks' time. If, however, you aren't comfortable buying second-hand components, and you want something that isn't going to struggle with modern games, I'd suggest saving a little more and going for the RX 6600, a review of which is linked on screen now. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.